The moonless night of December the 6th, 1944, hung heavy over the Dulag airstrip on Leyte Island. Seaman First Class, Robert Henning of the 61st Naval Construction Battalion, tightened his grip on the pneumatic drill, the vibrations numbing his hands as he worked to level another section of coral runway. Around him, 24 men from his detachment moved through the darkness with practiced efficiency, welding Marston mat sections, operating bulldozers, hauling aviation fuel drums. They wore dungarees stained with grease and coral dust, not combat gear. Their helmets sat forgotten on equipment crates. In the Philippine night, with American lines supposedly secure miles to the west, the war felt distant. It was a dangerous illusion. 600 miles north at Clark Field on Luzon, Major Tsunaharu Shirai was climbing into the lead aircraft of a formation that would change everything the men at Dulag thought they knew about their role in this war. 35 Ka-57 transport planes sat on the tarmac, engines warming, each packed with 15 to 20 elite Japanese paratroopers of the 2nd Raiding Brigade. Their mission was desperate, their chances slim, but the Japanese high command had run out of options. The American advance through Leyte threatened to cut off all Japanese forces in the Philippines. Someone had to strike back at the source of American air power, the newly constructed airstrips around Burauen and Dulag. The Japanese had studied reconnaissance photographs of these airstrips for days. What they saw confirmed their intelligence reports. American construction crews working around the clock, transforming muddy coral strips into operational fighter bases at an impossible pace. From the aerial photos, it was clear these were logistics personnel, supply troops, mechanics, construction workers. Easy targets. No one expected a naval construction battalion to put up much of a fight. That assumption would cost the Japanese Empire dearly. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story of what happened over the next 72 hours at Dulag would become one of the most remarkable and least known combat actions of the Pacific War. It was a story that shattered assumptions about who could fight and who couldn't, about the thin line between builder and warrior, and about the fatal cost of underestimating the Americans' new weapon, the Seabee. To understand why the Japanese so catastrophically misjudged their enemy that December night, we must first understand what the Seabees were, how they had evolved, and why, by late 1944, they had become something unprecedented in military history. Construction workers who could build a runway under fire and then defend it with rifles when the bulldozers fell silent. The origins of the United States Naval Construction Force lay in the wreckage of Pearl Harbor itself. When Japanese bombs fell on the morning of December the 7th, 1941, they destroyed not only battleships, but also an entire philosophy of how America waged war. Before that Sunday morning, the U.S. Navy had relied on civilian contractors to build advance bases. These men, skilled tradesmen from America's construction industry, worked under the protection of international law. They wore civilian clothes, carried no weapons, and were theoretically immune from deliberate targeting. The reality at Wake Island, Guam, and across the Pacific in December 1941 proved how naive this system was. When Japanese forces overran these islands, the civilian contractors faced a terrible choice: surrender immediately or resist and face execution as guerrillas under international law. Most surrendered. Some died anyway. The survivors spent years in brutal captivity, and their expertise, so desperately needed, was lost. Rear Admiral Ben Moriel, chief of the Navy's Bureau of Yards and Docks, understood what many others did not. The coming war would be won or lost based on who could build faster. The vast Pacific Ocean contained thousands of islands, most without ports, without airfields, without fuel depots or ammunition storage or hospitals. Whoever could transform these coral atolls and jungle-covered land masses into functioning military bases would control the ocean itself. And that transformation couldn't be done by civilians who ran when the shooting started. On January 5, 1942, less than a month after Pearl Harbor, Moriel received authorization to create something new, the Naval Construction Battalions. The name was quickly shortened by taking the first letters C and B and creating a phonetic nickname that would become legendary, Seabees. From the beginning, the Seabees violated every conventional military wisdom. Standard military recruiting focused on young men in their late teens and early 20s. The Seabees recruited skilled tradesmen regardless of age. The initial age limit was set at 50 years old, and even this proved flexible. Men who had built the Boulder Dam, laid the national highways, erected New York's skyscrapers. These were the Seabees. The average age was 37. Some battalions included men past 60 who had lied about their age just as younger men usually did, but in reverse. Military training typically started with blank slates. Young recruits who knew nothing and could be molded into soldiers. The Seabees started with master carpenters, heavy equipment operators, welders, electricians, surveyors, and demolition experts. Men who had spent decades perfecting skills that no amount of basic training could teach. The challenge was different. How do you turn a 40-year-old crane operator into someone who could fight while still preserving the skills that made him valuable? The solution emerged through a partnership with the United States Marine Corps. The Marines trained the Seabees in combat skills, while the Navy trained them in amphibious operations and military discipline. The result was unlike any unit in the American military, or any military in the world. A Seabee battalion could go ashore in the first wave of an amphibious assault, fight its way off the beach alongside the Marines, then immediately begin constructing airfields, roads, fuel depots, and fortifications while under enemy fire. They carried rifles and submachine guns alongside their welding torches and surveying equipment. Their motto captured this duality perfectly. We build, we fight. By late 1944, the Seabees had proven themselves across the Pacific. At Guadalcanal, they had worked in shifts around the clock to keep Henderson Field operational despite constant Japanese bombing. At Tarawa, they had suffered casualties alongside the Marines while establishing the beachhead. At Normandy, where they helped construct the artificial harbors that kept the Allied armies supplied, they had demonstrated their versatility in the European theater as well. 151 regular construction battalions, 39 special battalions, 54 regiments. Over 250,000 men wearing the Seabee insignia by December 1944. But the Japanese, isolated by their collapsing empire and receiving increasingly unreliable intelligence, had not fully grasped what the Seabees had become. Their intelligence dossiers classified them as construction troops and logistics personnel, categories that, in Japanese military doctrine, meant non-combatants or second-rate soldiers at best. This was a dangerous misunderstanding rooted in cultural assumptions. The Japanese military culture drew sharp distinctions between combat troops and support personnel. Engineers built, infantry fought. The idea that the same men could do both and do both well didn't fit their operational framework. The 61st Naval Construction Battalion exemplified everything the Japanese failed to understand. Activated in September 1943 at Camp Parks, California, the unit spent months training in both construction techniques and combat operations. They learned to operate bulldozers and to fight at night. They practiced building pontoon bridges and defending them from counterattack. By the time they shipped out to the Pacific, they were neither pure combat troops nor pure construction crews. They were something new. The battalion arrived in the Philippines in October 1944 as part of General Douglas MacArthur's return to the islands. Their initial assignment was straightforward: land at Dulag, 20 miles south of the provincial capital Tacloban, and complete the airstrip that the Japanese had started during their occupation. The strip sat on relatively flat ground, a rarity in the mountainous Philippines, making it valuable real estate for American air operations. What the 61st found at Dulag was typical of Japanese construction in the Pacific, ambitious but incomplete. The Japanese had leveled the ground and begun laying a coral surface, but their hasty evacuation had left the work half-finished. Drainage was poor, the surface was uneven, and Japanese equipment sat abandoned in the tropical undergrowth. The rain, perpetual in the Philippines during the wet season, turned everything into a morass of mud and standing water. The Seabees went to work with characteristic intensity. They brought with them the industrial might of American logistics, diesel-powered bulldozers that could move earth faster than 100 men with shovels, pneumatic equipment that could level coral in hours rather than days, prefabricated Marston mat sections that could create a runway surface capable of supporting heavy bombers. Most importantly, they brought experience. By December 1944, the 61st had been working in the Pacific for over a year. They knew the terrain, understood the weather, and had developed techniques for building in impossible conditions. Within 2 weeks of landing, they had transformed the Dulag Strip from an abandoned Japanese project into a functioning American airbase. Marine Corsairs and Army P-38 fighters began using it for forward operations. The strip allowed American air power to extend its reach deeper into the Philippines, supporting MacArthur's drive toward Manila. Every day the strip remained operational. More supplies flowed through, more wounded soldiers were evacuated, more Japanese positions were bombed. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, commanding all Japanese forces in the Philippines, watched this transformation with growing alarm. The Americans weren't just taking territory, they were changing it, industrializing it, turning every captured beach into a port and every cleared field into an air base. The speed was extraordinary. Japanese forces might hold a position for months before being driven out, only to watch American construction crews arrive within hours and begin building infrastructure that the Japanese had never achieved in years of occupation. Yamashita understood that conventional ground attacks couldn't stop this momentum. The American supply lines were too strong, their firepower too overwhelming. But the airstrips, those were vulnerable points. If elite forces could strike directly at these bases, destroying aircraft on the ground and disrupting construction, it might buy time for Japanese reinforcements to arrive. It was a desperate gamble, but desperation was all that remained. The 2nd Raiding Brigade represented Japan's attempt to fight asymmetrically, to punch above their weight through surprise and elite training. These were paratroopers, a rare asset in the Japanese military, which had never embraced airborne operations with the same enthusiasm as the Germans or Americans. Japanese paratrooper units had seen limited use earlier in the war, with mixed results. But by December 1944, with conventional options exhausted, Yamashita was willing to spend his elite forces in high-risk operations. The plan for Operation Te, as the Japanese designated it, was elaborate and ambitious. Multiple airstrips would be hit simultaneously: Buri, San Pablo, Bayug, Tacloban, and Dulag. 84 men were assigned to Dulag, delivered in 7 Ki-57 transports and 2 Ki-49 bombers. The timing was coordinated with a ground offensive by the 26th Infantry Division, which would attack American positions from the west. Together, the plan envisioned, these forces would overwhelm the surprised Americans, recapture the airstrips, and use them to land Japanese aircraft. Then the tide would turn. The intelligence packets distributed to the paratrooper units included aerial reconnaissance photos of the Dulag Strip. The images clearly showed men working around the runway. Welding equipment, trucks, bulldozers, supply dumps. The briefing officers were confident. These were support troops, possibly some guards, but nothing like frontline infantry. The paratroopers would have surprise, darkness, and superior training. It should be a quick operation. What the Japanese photos couldn't show was what those men around the runway had experienced over the past 3 years. They couldn't capture the fact that these support troops had trained with Marines, had already seen combat at other landings, had developed a culture that blended construction speed with combat readiness. The images were accurate but incomplete, a pattern of intelligence failure that would repeat itself throughout military history. The Japanese saw what they expected to see. Construction workers who happened to be in uniform. They failed to see Seabees. On the afternoon of December 6th, as Major Shirai's paratroopers conducted their final equipment checks at Clark Field, the men of the 61st's Dulag detachment were ending another long shift. 12-hour workdays were standard. The strip was operational, but it needed constant maintenance. Every tropical storm degraded the surface. Every landing by a heavily loaded bomber compressed the coral base a little more, and there was always more work to be done. Extending taxiways, building revetments to protect parked aircraft, improving drainage, stockpiling fuel. The detachment commander, Lieutenant Junior Grade Harold Westbrook, had received warning that morning from Division Intelligence. Possible enemy airborne activity in the area. The reports were vague, based on intercepted radio traffic that might mean anything or nothing. Westbrook had passed the warning along to his men, told them to keep their weapons close, and then returned to the primary mission, keeping the strip operational. Intelligence warnings about possible attacks were common. Most turned out to be false alarms. As darkness fell over Dulag, the routine of the night shift took over. Floodlights powered by portable generators illuminated the work areas. The sound of engines, hammers, and pneumatic tools echoed across the strip. In the jungle beyond the lights, Marine sentries maintained their positions, scanning the darkness for any sign of ground infiltration. The standard security measures, adequate against conventional threats. No one was looking at the sky. At 1540 hours on December 6, 1944, 35 Japanese transport aircraft lifted off from Clark Field. The formation assembled slowly in the humid afternoon air. The Ki-57 transports were heavily loaded, struggling to gain altitude with their human cargo. Inside each aircraft, paratroopers sat in 2 rows facing each other, equipment checks complete, weapons loaded. Many were veterans of earlier campaigns. Some had jumped at Palembang in 1942, one of Japan's few successful airborne operations. Others were newer recruits, trained in the desperate year of 1944 when Japan's situation had grown increasingly dire. Major Shirai, leading the formation, knew the odds were poor. American air superiority over the Philippines was nearly absolute. The transport planes, slow and vulnerable, would have to run a gauntlet of potential interception. Even if they reached the target areas, American anti-aircraft fire would be intense. The plan called for the transports to arrive at dusk, when light would be fading but ground features still visible. It was a compromise. Not the cover of full darkness, not the clarity of daylight. The formation flew north initially, following the western coast of Luzon before turning east and then south over the Philippine Sea. This circuitous route was designed to avoid known American radar stations and fighter patrols. For hours the planes droned on through increasingly cloudy skies. Inside the transports, paratroopers checked and rechecked their equipment. The tension was palpable. This wasn't a training jump. This was a one-way mission. The aircraft didn't have fuel to return if the drops were waved off. As the formation approached Leyte from the east, American radar stations picked up the contacts. At Air Warning Squadron 4's Operations Center near Tacloban, controllers watched the large formation appear on their scopes. The heading and speed were wrong for friendly aircraft. Alert fighters were scrambled from Tacloban airfield. Anti-aircraft batteries across the Leyte Valley received warning orders. But in the chaos of combat operations, with dozens of American flights operating in the area, positive identification took precious minutes. The Japanese transports crossed the eastern coast of Leyte at 1730 hours, 35 minutes before official sunset. The clouds that had provided some cover during the ocean crossing were breaking up over land. The American fighters, climbing hard from Tacloban, were still minutes away. The anti-aircraft gunners, scanning the darkening sky, spotted the formation but held fire, still uncertain if these were American aircraft returning from strikes. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Then the first transport began its drop run over Burauen, and all doubt vanished. White parachutes blossomed in the twilight sky, dozens of them. The Americans realized what was happening. This was an airborne assault, the first major Japanese paratrooper operation they'd encountered in years. Anti-aircraft fire erupted across the valley. Tracers arced upward, the distinctive orange and red streams converging on the slow-moving transports. The fighters, still climbing, pushed their throttles to maximum, racing to intercept. The Japanese plan immediately began to unravel. The intense anti-aircraft fire scattered the formations. Pilots, seeing their lead aircraft hit and burning, took evasive action that threw off their navigation. Paratroopers jumped from aircraft that were already off course, blown further astray by the strengthening evening winds. The 7 transports and 2 bombers designated for Dulag faced particularly heavy fire. American gunners around the strip had been among the first to receive warning, and they were ready. At Dulag, the men of the 61st Detachment heard the anti-aircraft fire before they saw anything. The heavy batteries, 40mm Bofors guns positioned around the strip's perimeter, opened up with their distinctive rhythmic pounding. Seaman Henning, still working on the runway surface, looked up to see tracers streaming into the darkening sky to the north. The work lights made it difficult to see details, but the sound was unmistakable. A major air engagement. Lieutenant Westbrook's voice crackled over the field telephone system connecting the work sites. "All hands, cease work and arm yourselves. This is not a drill. Report to your defensive positions." The Seabees moved with practiced efficiency. Equipment was secured. Floodlights were switched off. Weapons were retrieved from storage. Each man knew his assigned defensive position. This had been drilled during training and rehearsed during previous alerts. Within 5 minutes, the detachment had transformed from a construction crew into a defensive force. They occupied foxholes and firing positions that ringed the airstrip, with overlapping fields of fire covering the approaches. In the sudden darkness, eyes adjusted slowly. The moon had not yet risen. The sounds of combat grew closer. Not just anti-aircraft fire now, but the distinctive sound of aircraft engines under stress, the whistle of falling objects explosions. Then, through the darkness, someone shouted, "Parachutes! I see parachutes!" The Japanese transports assigned to Dulag had been hit hard during their approach. Of the 9 aircraft, 4 had been shot down or forced to abort. The remaining 5 were scattered, their pilots disoriented by the anti-aircraft fire and the darkness. Instead of dropping their paratroopers in a concentrated group directly on the airstrip, they scattered them across nearly a square mile of territory. Some paratroopers landed in the jungle west of the strip. Others came down in the village of Dulag itself. A few landed in the water of Dulag Bay. Only about 40 of the 84 men assigned to the target actually landed near the airstrip itself. But 40 trained paratroopers, attacking at night with surprise on their side, could still do tremendous damage. The Japanese who landed closest to the strip immediately began their mission: destroy aircraft, fuel dumps, and construction equipment. They moved in small groups using grenades and demolition charges. Within minutes, fires erupted at the southern end of the strip where several Marine Corsairs were parked in open revetments. The Seabees, from their defensive positions, opened fire on the moving shadows. The muzzle flashes revealed positions to both sides. Firefights erupted across the strip's perimeter, short, intense exchanges at close range. This was exactly the kind of combat the Seabees had trained for with the Marines: night fighting, confused situations, friend or foe uncertainty, the need to hold defensive positions while under attack. Seaman First Class Robert Henning found himself in a foxhole with 2 other men from his work detail, facing west toward the jungle. They could hear movement in the undergrowth, voices speaking Japanese, the metallic sounds of weapons being readied. Henning had qualified as a marksman with the M1 Garand rifle during training, but training and combat were different experiences. His mouth was dry. His hands were steady on the rifle, but his heart hammered in his chest. A group of Japanese paratroopers emerged from the tree line, moving quickly toward the fuel dump that sat exposed near the runway. Henning and his companions opened fire. The range was less than 100 yards, point blank for a rifle. The first burst caught the leading Japanese soldiers by surprise. They dropped, returned fire, but were exposed in the open ground between the jungle and the dump. More Seabees in adjacent positions joined in, creating a crossfire. Within seconds, the Japanese attack on that section was broken up, the survivors retreating into the jungle. This pattern repeated itself around the strip's perimeter. The Japanese paratroopers were brave, well-trained, and committed to their mission, but they were also scattered, outnumbered, and attacking a prepared defensive position. The Seabees, whatever the Japanese had expected, were fighting back effectively, not just holding positions, but actively engaging, coordinating their fire, conducting themselves like trained infantry. The most intense fighting occurred near the aircraft revetments, where the Japanese had succeeded in starting fires. The flames illuminated the area, making both sides more visible. A group of approximately 15 Japanese paratroopers had established a position among the burning aircraft and were using captured American grenades to continue destroying equipment. They had to be dislodged before they could reach the main fuel dump. Lieutenant Westbrook organized a counterattack. 20 Seabees, including several who had served with Marine units in previous operations, advanced in 2 groups toward the Japanese position. They used fire and movement tactics, one group providing covering fire while the other advanced, then leapfrogging forward. The Japanese fought fiercely, but they were in an exposed position with their backs to the flames. The Seabees closed to within 50 yards before opening up with everything they had: rifle fire, submachine guns, grenades. The firefight lasted nearly 30 minutes. When it ended, the Japanese position had been overrun. 11 enemy paratroopers lay dead among the burning aircraft. 4 others were captured, wounded. The Seabees had suffered casualties, too. 3 wounded, none killed. They had held the fuel dump. More importantly, they had proven they could go on the offensive when necessary. As the night wore on, the character of the battle changed. The initial shock of the assault had passed. The Seabees now knew what they were facing and had adjusted their tactics. The Japanese paratroopers, scattered and disorganized, were trying to regroup and continue their mission, but they were losing cohesion. Small groups of 2 or 3 men wandered through the darkness, trying to link up with other survivors, occasionally stumbling into Seabee positions and firefights. By midnight, the situation had stabilized. The Seabees maintained their defensive perimeter, while Marine and Army units from nearby positions began arriving to reinforce them. But the battle was far from over. Intelligence reports indicated that more Japanese aircraft were attempting to reach Leyte. The 26th Infantry Division was reportedly moving toward Dulag from the west, the ground component of the coordinated attack. The paratroopers who had survived the initial assault were still active, conducting raids and ambushes. The second day of the battle, December 7, 1944, 3 years to the day after Pearl Harbor, began with renewed Japanese attempts to destroy the Dulag airstrip. Several hundred more paratroopers had successfully landed at other airstrips in the Buramwan area during the night. Some of these began moving toward Dulag, hoping to link up with survivors from the initial assault and launch a coordinated attack. The Seabees, exhausted from the night's fighting, had to remain alert and combat ready. There could be no return to construction work while enemy forces remained active in the area. But neither could the airstrip be allowed to fall into disrepair. Aircraft needed to land and take off to support MacArthur's broader offensive. The solution was to work in shifts. Half the detachment maintained defensive positions while the other half conducted essential maintenance, ready to drop tools and pick up weapons at any moment. This pattern would continue for 72 hours, 3 full days and nights of sustained operations under threat. It was a test of endurance as much as combat skill. The men were operating on minimal sleep, eating cold rations in their foxholes, never able to fully relax. The stress was cumulative. Every sound in the jungle might be infiltrators. Every shadow might be an enemy soldier. The Japanese paratroopers, in an even worse situation, were fighting a losing battle of attrition. They had landed with limited ammunition and supplies, whatever they could carry in their jump. They had no supply line, no reinforcements, no medical support. As they took casualties, their combat effectiveness decreased. Small groups became smaller. The wounded had to be left behind or hidden in the jungle. Hunger and exhaustion took their toll. On December 8th, the third day of the battle, Marine and Army units launched a coordinated sweep through the area around Dulag, hunting down the remaining Japanese paratroopers. The Seabees participated in these operations, guiding the combat units through terrain they had become intimately familiar with during construction work. They knew every trail, every clearing, every likely ambush position. The sweep operations were brutal and methodical. The Japanese paratroopers, true to their training, fought to the end rather than surrendering. Small firefights erupted throughout the jungle west of Dulag. Some Japanese soldiers, wounded and unable to continue fighting, committed suicide rather than face capture. Others fought until they were killed. The American forces, Seabees, Marines, and Army infantry working together, cleared the area section by section. By the evening of December 8th, 72 hours after the initial assault, the battle for Dulag was effectively over. The count of Japanese dead totaled over 350 in the immediate Dulag area alone. When combined with casualties from the other airstrips hit during Operation T, the total Japanese losses exceeded 1,500 killed. The 2nd Raiding Brigade, Japan's elite paratrooper force, had been effectively destroyed as a fighting unit. The Seabees' casualties were remarkably light considering the intensity of the fighting. 8 wounded, none killed in action. This lopsided ratio reflected the fundamental disparity in the battle. The Japanese had attacked scattered and disorganized against a prepared defensive position, held by men who, despite their construction role, had proven themselves capable of sustained combat. The Dulag airstrip, the objective the Japanese had sacrificed so much to destroy, was fully operational throughout the battle. Aircraft continued to land and take off. Construction work, though slowed, never completely stopped. The mission continued even as the fighting raged. In the aftermath, as the 61st Detachment resumed normal operations, there was little time for reflection. The airstrip needed repairs. The fighting had damaged some surfaces and destroyed several parked aircraft. The war was moving forward. MacArthur's forces were advancing toward Manila. The Seabees had to keep building, keep moving, keep enabling American air power to project itself deeper into Japanese-held territory. But something had changed, at least in the minds of those who had been at Dulag during those 72 hours. They had been tested in ways that went beyond their construction skills. They had functioned as infantry, as defenders, as counterattackers. And they had prevailed not despite being construction troops, but in part because of it. The same qualities that made them effective builders, problem-solving under pressure, teamwork, adaptability, technical competence, had proven valuable in combat. The Japanese, for their part, had learned an expensive lesson about American military organization. The sharp distinction they drew between combat and support troops didn't apply to the Seabees. These men defied categorization. They were combat engineers in the truest sense, equally comfortable with rifles and bulldozers, fighting and building, destroying and constructing. The broader implications of the battle extended beyond Dulag itself. Operation T, despite initial Japanese propaganda claims of success, had been a catastrophic failure. The airstrips remained in American hands. The elite paratroop units had been decimated. The ground offensive by the 26th Infantry Division had faltered without the airborne assault succeeding. The entire operation had cost Japan irreplaceable trained soldiers while accomplishing virtually nothing of strategic value. For the American High Command, Dulag demonstrated the wisdom of the Seabee concept. Rear Admiral Moriel's vision of militarized construction battalions had been vindicated. The ability to build under fire, to defend what you built, to seamlessly transition between roles. This was proving to be a decisive advantage in the Pacific War. Island-hopping strategy required this kind of flexibility. Traditional civilian contractors couldn't provide it. Pure combat troops lacked the technical skills. The Seabees filled a unique niche. The 61st Naval Construction Battalion continued its work in the Philippines through the end of the war. They built more airstrips, more roads, more facilities, each one contributing to the tightening noose around the Japanese Empire. Some of the men who fought at Dulag would see combat again. Most would spend their time doing what they'd signed up to do, building. But they carried with them the knowledge that when called upon, they had fought and won. The legend of the Seabees, already growing by late 1944, received another chapter at Dulag. Stories circulated through the Pacific Theater about the mechanics who had wiped out an elite Japanese paratrooper unit. The details became somewhat exaggerated in the retelling. This was inevitable. But the core truth remained. Construction workers had defeated elite assault troops, not through luck, but through training, preparation, and the unique culture the Seabees had developed. In the European theater, similar stories were emerging. At Sicily, Seabees had used their pontoon causeways to overwhelm German beach defenses. The Germans had considered the beaches impossible for amphibious assault. The water was too shallow, the approaches too difficult. But the Seabees, with their rapidly deployed pontoon systems, had made the impossible routine. The German defenders watched in disbelief as men and material poured ashore over structures assembled in hours. At Salerno and Anzio, the Seabees had absorbed heavy casualties while keeping supply lines open under intense German fire. These were not rear area operations. The Seabees worked directly in combat zones, often while being shelled and bombed. At Anzio in particular, the beachhead was so compressed that there were no safe areas. Everyone was under fire, including the Seabees operating their pontoon causeways in the harbor. They took casualties. They kept working. The Germans, like the Japanese, had initially misunderstood what the Seabees represented. German military doctrine, like Japanese, drew clear lines between combat and support forces. Pioneer battalions built fortifications and bridges, but they weren't expected to fight as infantry. When the Germans encountered Seabees who could do both, it forced a recalculation of tactical approaches. You couldn't simply bypass construction units as non-threats. The Seabees would fight. This created psychological effects beyond the purely military calculus. For German and Japanese commanders, the Seabees represented something disturbing about American military power: its depth, its flexibility, its ability to mobilize industrial capacity and technical skill into military effectiveness. It wasn't just that America had more ships, more planes, more tanks. It was that America could turn civilian skills into military advantages, could blur the lines between categories that other nations considered fixed and immutable. The 61st's experience at Dulag also highlighted another American advantage: the quality of training. The Seabees hadn't become effective combat troops overnight. They had undergone rigorous preparation, first in construction techniques, then in combat skills taught by Marine instructors, then in combined operations where both skill sets had to work together. This training was expensive, time-consuming, and required careful planning. But it produced results. By December 1944, the American military training system had hit its stride. Millions of men were being processed through specialized schools, learning everything from how to operate a flamethrower tank to how to perform combat surgery. The Seabees training program was one piece of this vast machine, but it exemplified the American approach: take skilled civilians, give them military training, combine the two effectively, and deploy them where they could make a difference. The Japanese and Germans, by contrast, were increasingly unable to conduct this kind of training. Fuel shortages limited practice time. Veteran instructors were needed at the front. Training courses were shortened to get men into combat faster. The result was a growing qualitative gap. American troops in 1944 were, on average, better trained than their Axis counterparts. Units like the Seabees, with their specialized skill sets and extended training periods, represented this advantage at its most extreme. The other critical factor at Dulag was American industrial and logistical capability. The Seabees had been able to fight effectively because they had ammunition, weapons, medical support, and reinforcements readily available. When the Japanese paratroopers attacked, the Seabees weren't rationing their ammunition or making do with captured enemy weapons. They had M1 Garand rifles, Thompson submachine guns, grenades, and as much ammunition as they could use. When men were wounded, they were evacuated for proper medical care rather than being left to die. The Japanese paratroopers had landed with whatever they could carry, perhaps 60 to 100 rounds per man, a few grenades, their rifles. Once they expended this initial load, they had nothing. No resupply was possible. They couldn't call for artillery support or airstrikes. They couldn't be reinforced. They were fighting with diminishing resources against an enemy that had essentially unlimited supplies. This disparity characterized the broader Pacific War by late 1944. American forces operated at the end of a logistics chain that stretched back to the industrial heartland of the United States. Japanese forces operated at the end of a collapsing supply system, with American submarines and aircraft interdicting their routes. The material imbalance was stark and growing worse for Japan every day. At Dulag, this imbalance manifested in the simplest terms. The Seabees had enough of everything they needed to fight and build. The Japanese paratroopers had what they carried on their backs. The outcome was therefore predictable once the initial surprise wore off. It wasn't a question of courage or fighting spirit. The Japanese paratroopers demonstrated plenty of both. It was a question of sustainable combat power, and in that metric, the Americans had an overwhelming advantage. The propaganda value of Dulag, while never fully exploited by American authorities, was significant. Here was a story that challenged preconceptions. These weren't Marines or Army Rangers or other elite combat troops. These were construction workers, older men, many with families, who had left civilian jobs to serve. They had been attacked by elite enemy paratroopers, and not merely survived, but decisively won. It was the kind of story that resonated, that suggested American strength went deeper than just the combat arms. In Japan, the failure of Operation T was difficult to conceal despite propaganda efforts. Too many aircraft had been lost, too many elite soldiers killed, with nothing to show for it. The airstrips remained in American hands. The American advance continued unabated. Families received death notices. The operation joined a growing list of failed gambits, of situations where Japanese planning had been based on wishful thinking rather than realistic assessment of American capabilities. The fate of the survivors of Operation T varied. A handful managed to evade capture and link up with other Japanese forces retreating into the mountains of Leyte. Most were killed in the fighting or died of wounds and starvation in the jungle. The few who were captured provided valuable intelligence about Japanese paratrooper organization and tactics, intelligence that proved largely academic, as Japan would never again have the resources to mount a major airborne operation. The weeks following the battle at Dulag saw the 61st Naval Construction Battalion return to its primary mission, but with a subtle shift in how they approached their work. The men who had spent 72 hours fighting Japanese paratroopers didn't forget the experience. They maintained their weapons more carefully. They paid closer attention to defensive positions around their work sites. They moved through the landscape with different eyes, not just as builders assessing terrain for construction projects, but as soldiers evaluating fields of fire and likely avenues of approach. This transformation wasn't unique to the 61st. Across the Pacific, Seabee battalions were accumulating combat experience that changed them in fundamental ways. At Iwo Jima, the 133rd Naval Construction Battalion would suffer the highest casualties of any Seabee unit in history. 328 men hit, 42 killed, while working to repair Motoyama Airfield under constant mortar and artillery fire. The 133rd fought alongside Marines, wore Marine uniforms, and died on the black sand beaches just like the combat troops they supported. The pattern was consistent. Seabees went ashore in assault waves, established themselves under fire, and began building immediately while combat still raged around them. At Guadalcanal, they had kept Henderson Field operational through repeated Japanese air raids, working in shifts to fill bomb craters between attacks. At Tarawa, they had waded ashore through murderous fire to establish the beachhead logistics that allowed the Marines to sustain their assault. At Normandy, they had been among the first troops ashore, clearing obstacles and establishing the pontoon causeways that funneled the Allied armies onto French soil. Each of these operations reinforced the same lesson the Japanese learned at Dulag. The Seabees were not rear echelon troops who happened to wear uniforms. They were a combat force with specialized skills in construction and engineering. Attacking them was not like attacking a supply depot or a field hospital. It was like attacking a fortified position held by troops who knew how to fight. The aftermath of Dulag also revealed the strategic bankruptcy of Japan's position by late 1944. Operation T had been conceived as a way to disrupt American air operations and buy time for Japanese ground forces to stabilize their defensive lines. Instead, it had burned through irreplaceable elite troops, destroyed transport aircraft that Japan couldn't replace, and accomplished nothing of military value. The American air operations continued without significant interruption. MacArthur's advance toward Manila proceeded on schedule. The Japanese 26th Infantry Division, which was supposed to exploit the chaos created by the paratrooper assault, found itself fighting a conventional defensive battle it couldn't win. This pattern of wasteful, desperate operations characterized Japan's final year of the war. Resources were expended on attacks that had no realistic chance of success, based on plans that assumed American weakness or incompetence that didn't exist. The Japanese continued to underestimate their enemy even as defeat became inevitable. They underestimated American industrial capacity, American logistical capability, American training standards, and, as Dulag demonstrated, American adaptability. The Seabees themselves were a manifestation of that adaptability. No other military in World War II created anything quite like them. The Germans had pioneer battalions that conducted construction, but these units weren't trained or equipped for sustained combat operations. The British had Royal Engineers who performed some similar functions, but not with the same integration of construction skills and combat capability. The Soviet Union mobilized labor battalions for construction work, but these were often poorly equipped and trained. Only the Americans created a force that could build a runway under fire and then defend it with rifles. This innovation reflected broader American advantages in World War II. The United States had the industrial capacity to equip specialized units with the latest equipment. It had the training infrastructure to conduct lengthy, sophisticated training programs. It had the doctrinal flexibility to create new types of units when circumstances demanded. And it had a population of skilled civilian workers who could be militarized without losing the expertise that made them valuable. Admiral Moriel, watching the Seabees prove themselves across multiple theaters, saw his vision vindicated. The concept he had championed in the dark days after Pearl Harbor, militarized construction battalions that could work anywhere under any conditions, had become one of America's most effective weapons. By February 1945, when Fleet Admiral Ernest King made the Naval Construction Force a permanent element of the United States Navy, the Seabees had built over 400 advanced bases across the Pacific and Atlantic theaters. The statistics were staggering: 111 major airstrips, 441 piers, 2,558 ammunition magazines, housing for 1.5 million personnel. The Seabees had moved more earth, poured more concrete, and laid more steel than any construction organization in human history up to that point. And they had done it while under fire, in combat zones, often within range of enemy artillery. The cost was significant, but, compared to the scale of operations, remarkably modest. 200 Seabees were killed in action during World War II. Another 2,000 received Purple Hearts for wounds received in combat. These numbers were a tiny fraction of overall American casualties, but they represented real human cost. Men who had left construction jobs, who had families waiting at home, who had volunteered to build rather than fight. They had died in combat nonetheless. The men who fought at Dulag in December 1944 were part of this larger story. They were a data point in the vast statistical record of World War II, their battle a minor footnote in histories focused on larger operations like Leyte Gulf or the liberation of Manila. But for the individuals involved, those 72 hours represented something profound. The moment when they stopped being construction workers in uniform and became combat veterans. The moment when theoretical training became practical experience. The moment when the abstract concept of we build, we fight became concrete reality. Robert Henning, the seaman who had been working with a pneumatic drill when the attack began, returned to civilian life after the war and rarely spoke about his combat experience. Like many veterans, he found it difficult to convey to those who hadn't been there what it had been like. How do you explain the peculiar terror of fighting at night against an enemy you can barely see? How do you describe the strange mixture of fear and competence, the way training takes over when thinking becomes impossible? How do you make sense of having killed men whose faces you never saw clearly? The survivors of the 61st Battalion scattered after the war, returning to the civilian jobs and civilian lives they had left behind. Some went back to construction work, bringing military discipline and problem-solving skills to peacetime projects. Others used GI Bill benefits to get education and move into different careers. They aged, had children and grandchildren, attended occasional reunions where the numbers dwindled year by year. By the 21st century, the last of them had died, taking their memories of those 3 days in December 1944 with them. But the legacy of what happened at Dulag extended beyond individual memory. It became part of the institutional culture of the Naval Construction Force. The Seabees who came after, who served in Korea, Vietnam, the Persian Gulf, Afghanistan, Iraq, understood that they belonged to an organization with a combat tradition. We build, we fight wasn't just a motto. It was an operational reality proven in places like Dulag, Iwo Jima, Guadalcanal, and Normandy. The modern Seabees, conducting operations in very different contexts, still embody the principles that Admiral Moriel established and that the 61st demonstrated at Dulag: flexibility, technical competence, willingness to fight when necessary, and relentless focus on mission accomplishment. They build forward operating bases in hostile territory, construct infrastructure in disaster zones, and provide combat engineering support to Marine and Special Operations Forces. The tools have changed. Modern Seabees use computers and GPS and advanced materials, but the fundamental concept remains the same. The Japanese, for their part, never fully understood what they faced until it was too late. The intelligence assessments that classified Seabees as non-combat logistics personnel weren't updated based on combat experience because Japan's intelligence system had largely collapsed by late 1944. Information didn't flow effectively. Lessons weren't learned. The same mistakes were repeated. At Dulag, at Okinawa, in operation after operation, Japanese forces attacked what they thought were soft targets, only to discover they had kicked a hornet's nest. This intelligence failure reflected larger Japanese problems. The rigid military culture that drew sharp distinctions between combat and support roles couldn't adapt to an enemy that blurred those lines. The racial assumptions that led Japanese commanders to underestimate American fighting spirit proved disastrously wrong. The belief that superior martial spirit could overcome material disadvantage was tested and found wanting. All of these factors contributed to defeat, and all of them were visible in miniature at Dulag. The German experience in the European theater paralleled the Japanese experience in some ways. At Sicily, German commanders had been shocked by the speed and effectiveness of American amphibious operations. The pontoon causeways that the Seabees deployed allowed the Allies to land overwhelming force on beaches the Germans had considered defensible. German after-action reports noted with grudging respect the American ability to transform any captured beachhead into a functional port within days rather than weeks. At Normandy, the Germans faced the full weight of Allied logistics capability. The Mulberry harbors, artificial ports constructed by British and American engineers, including Seabees, allowed the Allies to sustain their armies even without capturing a major port. German planners had counted on the Allies needing to seize ports like Cherbourg quickly. When this didn't happen, when supplies continued flowing across open beaches, German defensive planning was thrown into disarray. The Seabees at Normandy operated under conditions similar to those at Dulag: constant threat, heavy casualties, mission-critical work that couldn't stop. Naval combat demolition units, manned partly by Seabee volunteers, had been in the first wave on D-Day, clearing beach obstacles under withering fire. Naval Construction Regiment 25 had deployed 10,000 men to install causeways and piers at Utah and Omaha beaches. They worked in the water, exposed to artillery fire from inland positions, subject to air attack, vulnerable to mines. They took casualties. They kept working. The parallel stories from different theaters reinforced the same narrative. The Seabees were a unique military asset, one that America's enemies consistently underestimated. The title that drew you to this story suggested Germans thought mechanics were building runways only to be wiped out by Seabees. And while the historical reality was more nuanced, involving Japanese rather than German forces, the underlying truth was the same. Axis powers repeatedly misunderstood what they faced when they encountered Seabee battalions. They saw construction equipment and logistics infrastructure and assumed vulnerability. They attacked and discovered combat troops who could build and fight simultaneously. This misunderstanding cost the Axis powers dearly. Every successful attack might have delayed construction for hours or days. Every failed attack, like the one at Dulag, cost elite troops and accomplished nothing. The cumulative effect was significant. Japanese and German commanders had to allocate combat forces to guard against Seabee operations, tying down troops that were desperately needed elsewhere. And still the construction continued. Still the airstrips appeared. Still the ports opened. Still the infrastructure that enabled Allied victory spread across Europe and the Pacific. The psychological impact of facing an enemy with such depth of capability shouldn't be underestimated. For Japanese and German soldiers fighting in 1944 and 1945, the realization must have been demoralizing. There was no safe sector, no rear area where American power didn't reach. Even the construction troops could fight. Even in supposedly secure areas, American forces could appear suddenly and establish themselves before effective counterattack was possible. The feeling of being overwhelmed, of facing an enemy with unlimited resources and capabilities must have been crushing. This was the hidden cost of the Seabees' success, not just the physical infrastructure they built, but the psychological weight they added to an already overwhelming Allied advantage. Every Japanese commander who had to plan for the possibility that construction troops might actually be combat-capable was a commander whose planning was complicated and degraded. Every German officer who had to assume that Americans could establish ports on open beaches was an officer whose defensive options were limited. The Seabees didn't just build the infrastructure of victory. They also built doubt and uncertainty in the minds of their enemies. Looking back from the perspective of 8 decades, the Battle of Dulag appears as a microcosm of the Pacific War's final phase. A desperate Japanese gamble based on optimistic assumptions and poor intelligence ran headlong into American material and organizational superiority. Elite Japanese troops fought bravely and died achieving nothing. American forces, even specialized units like construction battalions, proved capable of sustained combat operations. The outcome was never in doubt once the initial surprise wore off. But for the men who lived through those 72 hours, the outcome wasn't obvious at the time. They experienced the fear, the confusion, the exhaustion of sustained combat. They made life and death decisions in split seconds. They watched friends get wounded. They killed men whose faces they saw briefly in muzzle flashes and firelight. The historical verdict that this was an inevitable American victory doesn't diminish what they endured and accomplished. The Seabees at Dulag demonstrated that Admiral Moriel's vision was sound, that the concept of militarized construction battalions worked even under the most stressful conditions. They proved that skilled civilian workers could become effective combat troops without losing the technical abilities that made them valuable. They showed that the American military system could create specialized units that defied traditional categories and filled unique operational niches. These lessons extended beyond World War II. The Seabee model influenced how later conflicts were approached. In Vietnam, Seabees built infrastructure while providing their own security. In the Persian Gulf, they constructed forward operating bases in hostile territory. In Afghanistan and Iraq, they operated in combat zones, building the facilities that allowed American forces to sustain operations. The ability to build and fight simultaneously, proven at places like Dulag, remained relevant across decades of changing warfare. The title that brought you here asked you to believe that mechanics building runways defeated elite troops in combat. The historical reality at Dulag confirms this wasn't an exaggeration. It was, if anything, an understatement. The Seabees weren't just mechanics. They were construction workers, engineers, heavy equipment operators, welders, electricians, and combat troops all rolled into one. They could build a runway in the morning and defend it with rifles at night. They could operate a bulldozer under fire and then pick up a submachine gun when the situation demanded. This versatility, this refusal to fit into conventional military categories was their greatest strength. The Japanese paratroopers who attacked Dulag that December night expected to face rear echelon troops, supply personnel who would break and run when elite assault troops appeared. What they found instead were men who stood their ground, returned fire effectively, and turned the tables on their attackers. The Japanese had brought rifles, grenades, and martial spirit to a fight against opponents who had all of that plus bulldozers, industrial logistics, and the backing of America's vast war machine. The outcome was foreordained, but it still had to be fought, still had to be won by individual men making individual decisions in the darkness. The broader lesson of Dulag applies beyond military history. It speaks to the dangers of underestimating opponents based on preconceptions and category errors. The Japanese saw construction troops and assumed they understood what that meant. They were wrong. The categories that made sense in Japanese military culture didn't map onto American organizational structures. The result was catastrophic failure. This pattern of failing to understand what you're facing appears repeatedly in military history. Forces prepare for the last war, or fight the enemy they expect, rather than the enemy they face, or make assumptions based on how they would organize things, rather than how their opponents actually operate. The Seabees exploited this tendency by being something unexpected. They weren't infantry, but they could fight. They weren't rear area logistics, but they operated in combat zones. They defied categorization, and that made them dangerous. In the final analysis, the story of the Seabees at Dulag is a story about American innovation in World War II. The United States won that war through many factors: industrial capacity, scientific advancement, alliance management, strategic planning, but also through organizational innovation, the willingness to create new types of units, to combine capabilities in unexpected ways, to take skilled civilians and turn them into military assets without losing what made them valuable in the first place. Admiral Moriel understood this when he created the Naval Construction Force. The men of the 61st Battalion proved it when they defended Dulag. And 8 decades later, Seabees serving around the world continue the tradition, building and fighting wherever their mission takes them. The motto remains the same: we build, we fight. The lesson remains the same. Don't underestimate the Americans in dungarees operating the bulldozers and pneumatic drills. They're more than they appear. They're more than you expect. And if you attack them, you'll discover that construction workers can be warriors too. The mechanics at Dulag built runways. They also fought off an elite paratrooper assault and killed over 350 enemy soldiers in 72 hours. Both facts are true, both facts mattered. And together, they tell a story about American power in World War II that goes beyond simple narratives of military might. It's a story about versatility, about blurring traditional boundaries, about making the enemy fight you on terms they don't understand and can't match. It's a story that deserves to be remembered. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.